Deliverance Jason is the name of one of 8 people identified as female recorded in the 1792 to 1815 prison log of Berkshire Jail in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The jailer's entry tells us that Deliverance is 30 years old, with black complexion, black hair, and black eyes. Deliverance stands at 5 feet and 5 inches tall, hails from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and was imprisoned on September 10, 1800, for a crime that does not appear to be one at all, for the want of surety for her good behavior. Other crimes are named more simply: theft, burglary, adultery, counterfeiting money, etc. What is the nature of Deliverance's mysterious crime? Some orienting details will bring into greater focus the mysteries to which this one question opens out. So first, these are the 2 sides of the register itself. One side is marked as the so-called criminal side, the other as the debtor side. And the columns of the criminal side include, along this top row here, size, feet, inches as height, age, complexion, hair, eyes, place of abode, time of confinement, authority, crime, time and manner of escape or discharge, and Deliverance Jason's entry is our second to last right here. Notice that the log does not include a field requesting sex. Rather, one assumes that about 8 of the 150 entries were people identified as women because of their names: a Charlotte, 2 Hannahs, Polly, Peggy, Mercy, and Susanna. We only know the presumed gender of Deliverance because of how her crime reads, with a pronoun, for want of surety for her good behavior. In addition to the absence of sex, race is not a word that appears in this log either. However, through the fields complexion, hair, and eyes, we can begin to see the jailkeeper was attentive to the categories of physical perception that converge in the construction of race as visible and classifiable. The register's civil side does not include such fields at all, suggesting that tracking physical appearance was deemed necessary only for those deemed criminal. That Deliverance's fields indicate black, black, and black for complexion, hair, and eyes suggests she was one of roughly 60 people of African descent living in Stockbridge at that time. This essay uses the pronouns she and her for Deliverance, as they are likely the best approximations of the preferred pronouns of a female-presenting person in 1800. Yet I invite my listeners to consider that Deliverance's was a gendered subjectivity to which we do not have access, and was therefore not only more complex, but potentially less normative than what the prison register and historical detail will allow. The case of Deliverance Jason, I suggest, occasions an opportunity to think more deeply about gendered and racialized constructions of criminality in the nascent United States. While Deliverance's crime has legal precedent and even shows up in a colonial-era law book, I will suggest that understanding its implications requires unpacking, contextualization, and analysis. From the outset, this entry at once evidences a life of which we can know little, a clue into the ways in which crime was already racialized, and to use the term of literary theorist Hortense Spillers, evidence of the ungendering function of the penal space. 1. I'll open by only quickly stating a conclusion I came to about the legal meaning of this crime, but please feel free to follow up with me about the longer process arriving there. In short, we may imagine Deliverance's situation to have been something like this. Brought to jail for behavior undesirable to a more socially powerful other, her crime was put to bail. Think a monetary surety or bond, which she could not afford, and thus Deliverance was held for want of surety for her good behavior. What precisely comprised good behavior for a black female-presenting person in Massachusetts in the year 1800, and at whose mercy, would have been entirely up to the discretion of the authority deeming them in need of jailing. But there are both generally evocative and then also concrete possibilities to consider. First, following legal historian Risa Goluboff, I would suggest that good behavior can be understood generally in the context of vagrancy laws, which, dating back to the 14th century England, but gaining particular force in the 18th, made their way to colonial American norms, and some actually persist to this day. These laws use language describing not behavior, good or otherwise, but character, and enforcing them is up to the discretion of legal authority. In Michel Foucault's quotation from a 1796 memorandum by the physiocrat and judge Latrance, we see that vagabondage connoted threat. Vagabonds live, I quote, in the midst of society without being members of it, and in a state that one supposes existed before the establishment of society. He recommends that they be rounded up, deported, or killed. For Latrance, the nature of the threat is pre-civilizational, fundamentally undifferentiated, and thus asocial. Foucault marshals this quotation in order to describe a social transformation underway in Europe at the time. The right to punish had shifted from vengeance of the sovereign to the defense of society. This gaze-dependent character of the vagabond is so frightful because they are framed as a fright to everyone, not just the monarch. Deliverance's comportment, perhaps, being or behavior, may have evoked this kind of fear in an authority. Second, the more concrete. Deliverance may have been imprisoned for failure to comply with an employer, or she may have been a quote-unquote transient. We must note first that we cannot assume that Deliverance had been enslaved. Our clues indicate that she has a surname, Jason. Enslaved people of African descent in New England would appear in legal documentation, including this very register, with variations on the word Negro in place of a surname. Further, many if not most people of African descent in 1800 Massachusetts were of non-slave status due to a series of suits for freedom that occurred in 1780, most famously that of Elizabeth Freeman. Last, many blacks in the Berkshires had never been enslaved in the first place. We can assume, though, that Deliverance would have performed some kind of domestic labor. Historian David Montgomery demonstrates how a servant convicted of disorderly behavior could be committed for up to 30 days, but most often they were discharged into the custody of master or mistress after 10 days to 2 weeks in jail by the same justice of the peace that had sent them. That was a quotation. Indeed, Deliverance was incarcerated for exactly 10 days, and the same authority who committed her, Eldad Lewis Esquire, was responsible for her release. Deliverance Jason may not have labored long in the Berkshires, however, because her surname, Jason, does not appear in Berkshire County Census records at all. And so she may not have been a servant behaving badly, but rather someone whose non-resident status was the source of her legal encounter. Historian Ruth Wallace Herndon writes, the colonial term transient referred neither a homeless vagrant nor a traveler, but rather to someone living in town without legal residency. Because living in town for a year could grant you that residency, however, placing a person under warning effectively blocked their ability to become a resident or receive poor relief. Women in general and women of color in particular would have been more likely to be transient persons and thus threatened by such warnings. Yet transient women found creative ways of getting by. In 1782, a white woman named Margaret Bowler rented the Old Providence jail and had a number of other transient women as tenants. In 1799, a black woman named Jenny Rose supported herself and 2 children while her husband was at sea through domestic service and taking boarders. Such stories are notable for many reasons, but for us, they bring to light additional ways in which Deliverance Jason may have been behaving badly. 2. Recall that the word race does not appear in this log, but the words used to populate the complexion column reveal subtler ways in which the prison log bespoke white hegemony. For example, white does not appear as a descriptor for complexion, as do brown or black. Rather, modifiers like light and lightish presume that we can take for granted the color of the skin itself as already white. The ledger likewise presumes the space male. That the jailkeeper or courts did not consider sex an important feature to track should give us pause. Some indication of gender was usually given in other public records, and so the prison log is an anomaly. Crime has yet to be gendered in the legal canon at this point. I consider now how the classifications of Deliverance Jason's entry, with particular attention to blackness and femaleness, offer additional clues into perceptions white authorities would have had of her behavior, good or otherwise. Following the thought of Hortense Spillers, who suggests slavery ungendered black female bodies during the transatlantic slave trade, I suggest that the 19th century penal space likewise ungendered people otherwise identified as female. Spillers notes 2 sites of ungendering in the context of slavery. First, in the trade, letters of European colonists rarely noted the gender of the persons whose bodies they sold. Thus, the transactions and the shifts of the trade ungendered bodies. Second, female African flesh was ungendered by the fleshly vulnerabilities and horrors of slavery, simultaneously feminized by being target of rape, as well as being target of the peculiar province of male brutality. As a non-domestic space, a space of captivity, and a space in which a female body would have been vulnerable to different forms of gender violence, the Berkshire jail would have been an ungendering space. Through the prison register's omission of gender and use of distinctive adjectives for non-white skin, its words tacitly present the criminal as both male and of color. And yet, Deliverance's is the only entry that is explicitly gendered female, her good behavior. This reveals a simultaneous disavowal of femaleness and reaffirmation of it. The double classification tells us less about Deliverance as a person with a subjective sense of identity or being, and more about the bodies that would have been considered most normal within it, male-presenting ones. This bizarre regendering of Deliverance also suggests that what would have constituted good behavior would have been bound up in racializing and gendering and sexualizing projections imagined and performed by white, here likely male authorities. I would propose that this double classification of Deliverance as ungendered female and the great discretion involved in deeming her person or behavior not good might introduce, paradoxically, an unexpected flexibility in our reading of a ledger that otherwise promotes fixity. Could this uncanny openness also leave a discretionary space for the present-day interpreter of Deliverance's entry? And if so, of what good is that discretionary space, and for whom? 3. My reading of this prison register suggests that we are dealing less with an absence of Deliverance's good behavior than with an absence of Deliverance Jason. The prison log has kept an incredible amount of information, but produces an incredible absence as well, compounded by how little we can know about the people logged therein. In this way, the historical archive offers up an interplay between carceral clarity, or truth, and opacity. In the conclusion of this essay, I make some preliminary notes toward using history and writing to counter the teleological technologies of the prison project. Saida Hartman's Venus in Two Acts is a meditation on the circumstances by which a name, Venus, appears in the record of a legal indictment of a slave ship sea captain for the murder of 2 Negro girls. In her beautiful essay, Hartman laments how the names of this Venus and many others come to our attention only because of the unthinkable violences that befell them. In the book in which Hartman first named Venus, she wrote only 2 sentences about the archival person, for, I quote, "I feared what I might invent, and it would have been a romance." In Venus in Two Acts, Hartman follows a careful and measured process of what she calls critical fabulation, wherein she writes with and against the archive, using its details to imagine a friendship that could have blossomed between 2 frightened and lonely girls. Hartman's assessment of her own experiment is accepting and persistent, but not optimistic. Her counter-narrative will not install itself in history by precipitating material changes or social transformations. In fact, Hartman is convinced that her account replicates the very order of violence it writes against by placing yet another demand upon the girl, by requiring that her life be useful or instructive, by finding in it a lesson for our future or hope for history. Hartman speaks to my own questions around my search for deliverance and the meaning of her crime. My archive does not give me enough detail to practice critical fabulation, and I'm not confident my positionality would empower me to do so. However, I do want to note the possibility that if Deliverance had once been enslaved, she may have chosen her name, as Elizabeth Freeman and others had done upon winning suits for freedom. The meanings of the word deliverance that the Oxford English Dictionary furnishes makes me want to know so much more about Deliverance, the person. But I will not go farther than I have, for the dangers of following such fabulation toward unwarranted triumph or declarations of freedom, which are mine to struggle for with others, but not mine to claim. While recognizing the limits and dangers in writing against the archive, Hartman wonders how a narrative of defeat can enable a space for the living, or envision an alternate future. Can it, she wonders? Or is it better not to trespass the boundaries of the archive at all, to leave the girls as I had found them? Following Michel de Certeau, Hartman names 2 ways the historiographical operation may enable a space for the living. First, to establish, I quote, "to establish who we are in relation to who we have been." And second, to interrogate the production of our knowledge about the past. My project thus far has been an endeavor of the second kind. I've attempted some observations and connections regarding Deliverance's crime and how it relates to the imprisonment as social project. Perhaps it also establishes something of the distance and proximity between who we are and who we have been. But I also wonder how attending to an historical subject with care and curiosity might engender something like an ethic of care to be endeavored among the living. And so I'd like to add a third reason to Hartman and de Certeau's 2 on how history might enable a space for the living. Here I quote C. Riley Snorton when I say, "to seek to understand the conditions of emergence of things and beings that may not yet exist," end quote. And in so doing, to establish the possibility of who we may be. as those who could care for and be curious about others for their own sake. It cannot have material effects for those who lived 200 years ago, but it may change how one looks upon historical subjects, how one stands and moves in relation to them, and then certainly how one regards contemporary subjects as well. If being observed and having one's details described and reported belongs to a violent process of racialization, of othering, and of ungendering, how might a different form of attention be reparative and generative of a space for the living? I'm wondering whether and how to say and write the name of Deliverance Jason in ways that can give rise to something not yet imagined, in ways that write toward the not yet and could be, while writing unapologetically against the teleology of our contemporary disciplinary carceral state.